layer cells, basically. We've got goblet cells with produce mucus and cilia on the surface that actually moves that mucus toward your mouth as dirt and junk collect in it. Okay? And then otherwise, the stratified type of tissue is a epithelium is a protective layer, so like the epidermis and the skin, for instance. And then we have some that are real thin, and those would be like involved in diffusion, absorption, secretion of substances. And so, for instance, like in the air sacs of the lungs, where we're thinking about oxygen and CO2 diffusing. Okay? So anyway, that was kind of the overview for the epithelium. And again, we do look at the example, simple squamous epithelium, pseudostratified, with the picture showing, and the stratified squamous, which again we see in the epidermis of the skin. And again, we look at those three in lab again today, because they're on our lab test too. So, anybody have a thought on the tissues at this point so far? Epithelium. All right, so otherwise, then we look below the surface, and that's where you find the connective tissue. And so you see this chunk of tissue right here below the surface. That is our connective tissue. This is the most abundant, the most widespread, the most common type of tissue that we have. And so it's basically everywhere in the body under an epithelium, regardless of where it is. We have a particular cell called a fibroblast, which is the principal cell for connective tissue. And so on a picture like this right here, you see these little blobs of cells here, here, and here, three showing in the picture, and then move in one right there. Kind of have a cell body somewhat looking like the neuron cell body, except you don't have these long extensions. So this is the most common type of connective tissue cell. We particularly see it in the dense connective tissue. The thing about connective tissue, it has usually a lot of extracellular material. And so characterized as an ECM, extracellular material, means that it is produced by these fibroblasts actually and secreted outside of the cell, and basically forms a kind of structural framework for that connective tissue. The extracellular material I want you to be aware of here for connective tissue in general is called matrix. And matrix is a ECM that's composed of a kind of glue-like substance called ground substance. And then you also have fibers. And here we're talking particularly about the collagen sort of fibers. So when you look at this illustration right here, you can see that it's kind of diffuse looking in the background. Obviously, we got some blood vessels, and we've got some other kind of fibery kind of stuff in there, a few cells. But all of this kind of gray looking material represents the matrix, right? And again, the matrix is composed again of ground substance and collagen fibers. And you can see a few fibers here, the kind of little streaky looking deals right there. So this stuff kind of functions like cement and rebar, and so obviously the rebar is a structural component to the cement, but the cement on it solidifies around it, holds everything in place. That's basically what's happening with this matrix material. And so again, the ground substance itself is basically this kind of grayish looking background sort of material, and then all the little kind of light brown colored little linear deals are collagen fibers. And again, that forms a structural component for connective tissue. Okay? It has a lot of blood vessels as opposed to the epidermis, where we don't get any, or epithelium, sorry, we don't get any up here, but you can see there's blood vessels here in the matrix. And then it has a lot of receptors as well, not really showing on this one right here. Right, here's another one right here. So showing the fibroblasts as these big purpley looking cells. And so there's like 4 showing, you can see all this in here, matrix material. Again, ground substance is basically the glue component in a sense for the connective tissue. And then you have a variety of fibers, of which we're only concerned about collagen. And so you see this big, heavy, thick, almost cable looking band of fibers right there, kind of multiple layers all bound up. That's the collagen fiber. And there's some other ones as well. But the thing is, again, this kind of holds the connective tissue kind of in place and provides the structural characteristics for it. And again, anytime there is a reference to extracellular, that means it's outside of the cell, but it is the fibroblasts that actually produce this tissue. You can see this one's trying to like generate fibers over there on that end right there. Now, otherwise, you again see there's a blood vessel coming up right here. We do have a little nerve kind of coming up through the upper left corner right there, just showing that, connecting to nerve receptors or whatever the case may be. We also have, in the sense of connective tissue, immune function, because the epithelium itself is super thin, and so almost always when you damage your skin, it bleeds. So that means you've actually cut through the epithelium, you've damaged the capillary here, so you've got immune factors there within the connective tissue that are ready to respond to what? Stuff coming in. Bacteria, dirt, whatever the case may be. And so there are a variety of different types of cells, and we're showing here the neutrophil, which we talked about in the blood smear for the lab. Lymphocytes back up in here. We also have what are called macrophages, which are in here somewhere on a big yellow blob right here. These are all cells that contribute to your immune function and again protecting you whenever you happen to damage the skin. And of course we talk more about those later on when we're doing lymphatic types of system. All right, and then lastly, most of the connective tissue we talk about is going to be involved in kind of again, kind of structural under the surface. We do have a couple of forms of what we call fluid connective tissue. So that means it's transporting tissue. So the blood itself inside the blood vessel actually is considered to be a connective tissue, but obviously it's liquid. So it's a movement. Lymphatic fluid in the lymphatic system. Again, a fluid connective tissue transporting substances. And then the other one is up here in the CNS. We've got a cerebral spinal fluid there we'll talk about in the next unit that actually moves things through the brain and through the spinal cord. All right, and so anyway, that's kind of the general overview here for that. But again, under the epithelium. All right. So, anybody got a thought right now? All right, so as we look here at the connective tissue, there's actually quite a number of different types, but there's two basic categories. One's called embryonic, which means it's the principal connective tissue in the embryo itself. It's called mesenchyme, which we'll picture in a second, but the significance of the mesenchyme embryonic tissue is it forms all the other adult connective tissues that ultimately develop in the fetus and in the baby, and then ultimately, of course, as the child grows into an adult. We have for the adult connective tissue 4 categories. Connective tissue proper right here is got several things. We're talking about the adipose connective tissue, which we talked about in lab. We'll talk about again here. The dense kind of fibrous connective tissue, which we talked about in lab. We'll talk about again here. Those will be the 2 examples there. We'll talk about hyaline cartilage for the cartilage example, and then of course bone is bone and blood is blood, and we talk about these 2 later on more when we get actually to the units the systems that those are involved in. So we look briefly at this one here today, and then we look at these 2 right here, and again focusing on the ones we are emphasizing in the laboratory. And again, this is just another one of these, remind you about what extracellular material and matrix means. So again, this background stuff is the matrix, and again composed of the so-called ground substance, which basically is your adhesive in a sense. And then you see all the blue and the red in there representing the different fibers. And we are concerned about collagen as a fiber type here. And that is the principal type of fiber in connective tissue. Now, the thing about embryonic is, again, it's only in the embryo structure. And so basically what we have right here is a fairly uniform array of matrix material. You can see right there, has fibers in it, but they're pretty unprevalent at this particular time, so not very apparent. And then otherwise we have fibroblasts, and we have some other cells in there as well, but again, found in the body of the embryo. Again, the significance is that this will develop ultimately into all the different kind of adult connective tissues as they do begin to form. Okay, so mesenchyme is the example for the embryonic connective tissue. Now again, what we're going to be looking at for the adult, which is kind of the sort of more typical connective tissue proper, and the cartilage. The dense connective tissue has kind of the appearance kind of like the picture I just showed you. Adipose connective tissue is fat tissue. And so it's going to store lipid inside of these cells and kind of save it for energy storage, save it for cushioning and insulation of the body and that sort of thing. And we do see it in, array of different places in the body. Almost everything has some degree of fat type tissue, but the individual cells right here are adipose cells. And these, again, store the lipid here on the inside in the interior of the cell and basically push the nucleus and the cytoplasmic contents, however much there is to that, kind of up against the wall. So adipose connective tissue, bunch of openings right there, but again, they're full of, again, lipid type material. Illustrating a breast tissue, for instance, has adipose in it. There is adipose on the surface of the heart, adipose on the surface of the kidney, and then otherwise we see adipose down and the subcutaneous layer of the skin. Okay, and again, we show that here in a minute. Here's the picture I was showing you in the lab when we were talking about the tissue itself. So again, these are all individual cells. It's not multi-cells like the squamous, simple squamous air sac. A bunch of little cells make up this little thin membrane right here. But that's just one cell, two cells, three cells, and so on. And again, they fill with the lipid and pushes the nucleus, we already see one right there, to the edge of the cell. And then this one right here is to illustrate on the top, and if you do look at them with a three-dimensional kind of view, they look like little red balls, basically. And again, they're full of fat, and again, the more fat cells that you have, of course, although I would say that we don't really add fat cells, to be honest with you. We gotta have cells, but we add to the fat cells or more lipid. And so that makes them, of course, expand. But when you have a cluster of them together, it's like a bunch of little round balls, basically, all kind of jammed up together. So that reddish looking color on the top represents the adipose cells themselves. And then down here, you see the nucleus there, but down here again, it's showing that all that's lipid. And so it just pushes all the cytoplasm and the nucleus to the edge of the cell. So anyway, that's the first example of connective tissue proper. And again, the subcutaneous layer of the skin, which we talk about with the skin structure, is a really good place to think about its location, but also in the breast and on the surface of the heart, the surface of the kidney as well. Now, the dense fibrous connective tissue is characterized by having very densely packed collagen fibers. Saw that little purpley looking business in there. Those are the collagen fibers. Not a whole lot of the ground substance from the matrix showing through, but everywhere you kind of see the little purple blob that represents the position of a fibroblast, which again produces the matrix, again ground substance and the connective collagen fibers. So for us, we talked about the dermis of the skin as the main function. Show that picture here in a second, right? But also tendons, which connect muscle to bone, ligaments, which connect bone to bone, these little kind of capsule-y looking deals that go over joints. All of these are composed of this dense fibrous connective tissue, providing kind of tough, resistant sorts of coverings. So you can see on my picture right here that we're actually illustrating the shoulder joint capsule. So you got your bone, you got your muscle, but you have this actual container over it to help secure things. And again, that is dense fibrous connective tissue right there. Now, in the dermis of the skin, which is really where we talked about it, otherwise, again, you've got a bunch of fibers kind of running all kind of different directions, collagen for the most part. There is some elastic fibers in there. That's what gives the skin the ability to kind of stretch and come back to its original shape. By the way, that only happens to you when you're young. You get all like, what, droopy otherwise, you know. Something to look forward to, right? You know. But anyway, dermis. So right there is the bottom of the epidermis, and of course that extends all the way down out of the view until you get down to the fat layer, the subcutaneous layer, right? So again, a bunch of fibers running all different directions. Give the skin a lot of elasticity, a lot of durability, a lot of ability to stretch, return back to shape, a lot of structure to the skin, okay? And so anyway, that's the best place to think about for representative location for the dense connective tissue. And again, irregular there, not really emphasized. This means the fibers are running kind of all different directions as opposed to sort of more uniformly in one direction. All right, and then otherwise, cartilage. Now, cartilage is a structural component, but has flexibility. We do have for the cartilage a particular cell type as well, and this is called a chondrocyte. This is the cartilage producing cell. All right, cartilage always located in the matrix of the cartilage in a hole, and this hole is called a lacuna. And that is the characteristic feature for cartilage, is that you see this kind of smooth background material like we're showing right here. That is the cartilage matrix. Collagen fibers and chondroitin sulfate, I guess I should say that too, just to emphasize. Chondroitin sulfate is the material in the ground substance component of the cartilage. And then you've got, again, collagen fibers. And cartilage as a material, of course, different from your regular connective tissue, so it actually is a little bit different kind of component over here in the ground substance here. But in cartilage, the matrix, chondroitin sulfate, that's basically the ground substance, the glue material. And then you have collagen fibers. And depending on the nature of the cartilage, you may have not obvious collagen like we do with the hyaline, or you may have a little more obvious, just depends. We're only doing the hyaline. So anyway, smooth matrix with fibers hardly visible whatsoever. You see the little opening here, that's the lacuna hole that the actual cartilage is. Cells are in, and then the things on the inside right here are the cartilage producing cells, and again are called a chondrocyte. Now, the unfortunate thing about cartilage, and you may be aware of this if you've ever damaged cartilage, is that it heals pretty slowly. Bones will mend themselves a lot faster than cartilage will because bones are full of blood, right? So you get all your repair factors actually coming into the site of the wound, the break. Cartilage, there's no blood vessels on the inside, it's just on the periphery. And so you've got to rely on kind of a diffusion effect to get repair factors to the interior of the cartilage. So it does repair itself much, much more slowly than bone. Again, hyaline is what we're looking at. Just showing that costal cartilage, which is your rib cartilage right here, is an example of a location. We've got also your like little ends of your bone up here where it forms a joint called articular. Remember all the things I talked about in lab. I got it on here. Nasal cartilage, you know where you know this stuff, right here. And then finally the trachea rings, which are the little kind of support structures in your windpipe to keep it from collapsing. Those are all good representative locations. I think this is the slide I showed you, and the picture I showed you in the laboratory to illustrate the tissue. So again, smooth background, lots of kind of holes here, chondrocytes, and then the cells themselves. Usually only we see the nucleus staining, but that's called the chondrocytes themselves. Okay, chondrocytes in the tumor. All right, so anybody got a thought on that? See it? We point out chondroitin sulfate. You hear about it in the TV ads. Everybody's out to mend you, right? You know, but anyway, they always use that term because it is a cartilage ground substance component. You know, a little different when you're taking it in this direction as opposed to your body actually making it, but it can kind of help promote a little bit of cartilage repair if you have damaged your cartilage in some way or another. All right, and then otherwise, again, kind of the way otherwise within the lab, so lots of openings, and then on some of these you see the little opening with the little nucleus in the center. That is the chondrocyte nucleus. All right, so anyway, that's our overview of the tissues. Again, blood and bone, which also fall into the adult connective tissue category. And we'll talk about blood with the blood cardiovascular system. Talk about bone with the skeletal system.